Two rookie officers thought they were just stopping a suspicious black man. They had no idea they were handcuffing their own boss. When officers Parker and Reynolds pulled over Simons Marlowe, based on a vague description, they treated him like a criminal. Harsh words, drawn weapons, and handcuffs. They never bothered to check his ID. What happens when these officers discover the suspicious black man they've arrested is actually Chief Simons Marlowe, head of their entire police department? And what if the chief had been planning this all along? This powerful story explores what happens when bias meets badge, and how one man's experience might change an entire system. Simons Marlowe opened his eyes before his alarm clock rang. After 20 years on the police force, his body was used to waking up early. He reached over and turned off the alarm before it could make a sound. Next to him, his wife Lisa was still asleep. Simons slipped out of bed quietly and headed to the bathroom. He looked at himself in the mirror as he brushed his teeth. At 48, his short black hair was starting to show gray around the temples. 3 years as police chief of Westridge had added a few wrinkles to his face, too. A day off, he whispered to himself. A real day off. Back in the bedroom, he opened his closet and stared at his clothes. Usually, he reached for his uniform without thinking. Today was different. He pulled out a pair of blue jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. By the time he finished getting dressed, Lisa was awake and watching him with a smile. "I don't think I've seen you in jeans on a weekday in years," she said. Simons laughed. "I almost forgot I owned them." Lisa sat up in bed. "So, what's the plan for your day off? Let me guess. You'll check your email, call the station at least twice, and worry about work all day." "Not today," Simons said. "Today I'm just a regular guy doing regular things. I've got to pick up supplies for Zoe's graduation party. Maybe fix that loose board on the deck. Our baby girl graduating college." Lisa shook her head in wonder. First in the family. Pride swelled in Simons's chest. Their daughter Zoe was graduating from State University next week with a degree in computer science. She had already lined up a good job at a tech company. "She worked so hard," Simons said. "We need to make this party special." "She has no idea we're planning it," Lisa said. "She thinks we're just having a small family dinner." Simons headed downstairs to the kitchen and made coffee. While it brewed, he checked his phone. 5 emails from work already. He put the phone down without opening them. "Not today," he reminded himself. After breakfast, Simons kissed Lisa goodbye and headed for the door. As he reached for his car, keys! He paused by the small table where he usually kept his badge and gun. Out of habit, his hand moved toward them. "Leave them," Lisa called from the kitchen. "You're not Chief Marlowe today, remember? Just Simons." Simons nodded. "Just Simons," he repeated, trying the idea on for size. How long had it been since he was just Simons? Not Chief Marlowe, not Officer Marlowe, just himself? "You're right," he said. "No badge today." The weight of responsibility lifted from his shoulders as he walked out to his car. Not the police cruiser, but his personal vehicle, a blue sedan he rarely drove. The morning sun felt warm on his face. As Simons drove through town, he saw West Bridge differently. Usually, he noticed everything through a police officer's eyes, checking for traffic violations, watching for suspicious activity, nodding to his officers on patrol. Today, he was just another citizen enjoying a beautiful spring morning. People waved as he drove past. West Bridge was a mid-sized town where many folks knew the police chief by sight. Simons had worked hard to build good relationships in all parts of town, especially in the mostly black East Side where he'd grown up. His phone rang. It was the station. Simons almost answered automatically, but then remembered his promise. He let it go to voicemail. "They can handle things without me for one day," he said to himself. Simons pulled into the hardware store parking lot and checked his list. He needed tools and supplies to fix up the backyard for Zoe's surprise party. Lisa was handling food and decorations, but the backyard was his job. As he turned off the engine, Simons felt strangely nervous. It had been so long since he'd been out in public as just himself, not in uniform, not with his badge. Part of him felt naked without it. "Today, I'm not the chief," he reminded himself. "Today, I'm just a black man running errands." With a deep breath, Simons stepped out of his car and headed into the store, unaware that this ordinary day was about to become anything but. On the other side of West Bridge, Officers Jack Parker and Steve Reynolds sat in their patrol car, sipping coffee from paper cups. Both men were in their late 20s and new to the West Bridge Police Department. They had transferred from Pine Creek, a much smaller town about 50 miles away. "First day without training wheels," Parker said, adjusting his uniform collar. At 6 feet tall with short blonde hair, he looked like he'd stepped out of a police recruiting poster. Reynolds nodded, his brown hair cut in the same short style. "No more Sergeant Lopez watching our every move." "Thank goodness," Parker said. "I was tired of him breathing down our necks." The two officers had been friends since the police academy. When Parker decided to apply to West Bridge PD for better pay and more action, Reynolds had followed. They'd spent the last month learning the roads and rules of their new department. "Think we'll make any arrests today?" Reynolds asked, checking his gear. "I haven't cuffed anyone since we got here." Parker crushed his empty coffee cup. "Hope so. I didn't move to a bigger department to write parking tickets all day." Their radio crackled to life. "All units, roll call briefing." The officers drove to the station and joined the other day shift cops in the briefing room. Sergeant Williams, a tall black man with a serious face, stood at the front. "Listen up, people," Williams said. "We've had 3 convenience store robberies in the past 2 weeks, all on the west side, all following the same pattern. One suspect enters, shows a weapon, demands cash, and leaves on foot." He pointed to a map on the wall. "The stores are all within this 5-block area. The robberies happened at different times, but our suspect seems to be getting bolder. The last one was in broad daylight." Williams clicked a button, and a blurry security camera image appeared on the screen. "This is our only look at the suspect. Male, medium build, wearing a dark jacket and cap. Face not visible." Parker leaned over to Reynolds. "Not much to go on," he whispered. Williams continued, "I want extra patrols around Wilson Street today. Keep your eyes open for anyone suspicious. Local business owners are worried, and the chief wants this solved quickly." At the mention of the chief, several officers nodded respectfully. Parker and Reynolds exchanged glances. "Have you met the chief yet?" Parker whispered. Reynolds shook his head. "Just saw him from a distance at orientation." "I heard he's tough, but fair," Parker said. Williams cleared his throat loudly. "Officers, Parker and Reynolds, since you're new to the area, you'll patrol Wilson Street and the surrounding blocks. Get familiar with the stores and the people. Make your presence known." "Yes, sir," both officers replied. After the briefing, they headed to their patrol car. As Parker started the engine, Reynolds checked the map. "Wilson Street is mostly small businesses," Reynolds said. "Hardware store, coffee shop, couple of restaurants." "Perfect place for a rookie to make his mark," Parker said, pulling out of the station. "Imagine if we're the ones who catch this robber." "The chief would have to notice us then," Reynolds agreed. As they drove, they passed through different parts of West Bridge. The downtown area was busy with office workers. Further west, the neighborhoods became more diverse, with small businesses mixed among residential streets. "This place is different from Pine Creek," Parker said. "More people," Reynolds said. "More different kinds of people." Parker nodded. Pine Creek was pretty much all white folks. Here, you've got everybody. "Makes the job more complicated," Reynolds said. "Just means we need to be more alert," Parker replied. "My dad was on the force for 30 years. He always said you gotta trust your instincts about people." They turned onto Wilson Street and began their patrol, driving slowly past the stores. Parker watched people on the sidewalks, his eyes narrowing whenever someone matched any part of the vague description they'd been given. "There's the hardware store," Reynolds pointed. "Let's stop in, introduce ourselves to the owner." As they parked, neither officer noticed the blue sedan that passed them, driven by a black man in a gray t-shirt. "Today's the day," Parker said, straightening his uniform. "I can feel it. We're going to prove ourselves." Reynolds nodded eagerly. "Let's show Westbridge PD they were right to hire us." Simons pulled into the parking lot of Wilson's Hardware and found a spot near the entrance. He'd been coming to this store for years. Old man Wilson had retired last year, but his son Tim had kept the family business running. It was one of those places where everybody knew your name, especially if you were the police chief. As Simons walked through the automatic doors, he took a deep breath. The familiar smell of wood, metal, and the faint scent of coffee from the small pot Tim kept brewing for customers greeted him. "Chief Marlowe," Tim Wilson called from behind the counter. "Didn't expect to see you today, especially not in civvies." Simons smiled. "So much for being just a regular guy." "Day off, Tim. Working on some projects at home." "Must be important to tear you away from that desk of yours," Tim said with a grin. "My daughter's graduating college next week. Having a surprise party for her." Tim whistled. "Little Zoe? Graduating college already? Time flies." Simons nodded, feeling that same burst of pride. "Computer science degree. Got herself a job lined up and everything." "That's wonderful," Tim said. "Your dad would have been so proud." Simons's father had been Westbridge's first black police officer back in the 1970s. He hadn't lived to see his son become chief, but Simons felt his presence every day. "Thanks, Tim. Now I need to get this backyard in shape before the party." "What are we looking for today?" Simons pulled out his phone and showed Tim a list. "Deck needs some work. Got a couple of loose boards. Then I need to fix up the garden. Area, aisle 3 for the deck supplies," Tim said. "Garden stuff is in the back corner. Jake's working today. He can help you load anything heavy." Simons headed to aisle 3, grabbing a shopping cart on the way. As he examined different types of deck screws, he noticed a young man watching him from the end of the aisle. The employee wore a red vest with a name tag that read, Kevin. He was new. Simons hadn't seen him before. When Simons looked up, Kevin quickly pretended to be organizing a shelf. Simons was used to this. Even in his own town, even as police chief, when he was out of uniform, some people saw him differently. Simons continued shopping, adding items to his cart. He found some solar-powered garden lights that Lisa would love and added those too. All the while, he noticed Kevin following at a distance, watching. At the end of aisle 5, Simons ran into Mrs. Chen from the library. "Chief Marlowe," she said cheerfully. "How wonderful to see you." They chatted about the library's new reading program and Zoe's graduation. As they talked, Simons saw Kevin watching, looking confused as people greeted Simons warmly. After finishing his shopping, Simons headed to the checkout where Tim was waiting. "Find everything okay?" Tim asked. "Sure did," Simons replied. Looks like you've got a new employee." Tim glanced over at Kevin, who was now pretending to stock shelves nearby. "Yeah, Kevin started last week, still learning the ropes." As Tim meets, rang up the purchases, Simons noticed two police officers enter the store. He recognized them as the new transfers from Pine Creek, Parker and Reynolds. They hadn't met formally yet. The officers didn't notice Simons in his casual clothes and went straight to Tim. "Good morning, sir," the taller one said. "Officers Parker and Reynolds. We're increasing patrols in this area due to recent incidents." "Appreciate that," Tim said, continuing to bag Simons's items. "Though having our police chief as a customer makes us feel pretty safe today." The officers looked confused until Tim nodded toward Simons. But before Tim could introduce them, another customer called for help, and Tim excused himself. "I'll be right back, Chief," he said. The two officers glanced at Simons with mild curiosity, but didn't make the connection. To them, he was just another customer. They continued their conversation with Kevin, who had approached them. Simons paid for his items and loaded them into his small toolkit. Some of the larger supplies would be delivered later. As he left, he nodded to the officers, who nodded back automatically, still not realizing who he was. In the parking lot, Simons placed his toolkit under his jacket to protect it from the light rain that had started falling. He got into his car and drove away, thinking about the deck project ahead of him. Back in the store, Kevin approached the officers nervously. "Excuse me," he said. "That man who just left—" "What about him?" Parker asked. "He was acting suspicious," Kevin said. "Walking around the store, putting things in his jacket. I've been watching him since he came in." "In his jacket?" Reynolds asked, suddenly alert. "Yes," Kevin said. "And I've been told to watch out for suspicious people because of the robberies. He had something bulky under his jacket when he left." Parker looked at Reynolds. "Did you catch his license plate?" "Blue sedan," Reynolds said, "heading east on Wilson." Kevin didn't mention that everyone else in the store had greeted the man like a friend. He'd been too nervous about making a good impression on his new job, and showing the police he was vigilant seemed like the right move. "We'll check it out," Parker said, already heading for the door. "Thanks for the tip." The officers rushed out to their patrol car, eager for action, unaware they were about to stop the chief of their own police department. Simons drove east on Wilson Street, his mind already planning the deck repair. The light rain tapped on the car roof in a gentle rhythm. He turned on the radio to catch the weather report. Good news. Clear skies predicted for the rest of the day. In his rearview mirror, Simons noticed a police cruiser pull onto the road behind him. This was normal. In a town the size of West Bridge, he didn't think anything of it until the cruiser's lights started flashing. Simons checked his speed. He was driving exactly at the limit. He hadn't run any stop signs or made any illegal turns. For a moment, he wondered if there was something wrong with his car that he hadn't noticed. With the practiced calm of someone who had conducted hundreds of traffic stops himself, Simons signaled and pulled over to the curb. He put the car in park and placed his hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible. This was standard procedure that he taught all his officers. Through his side mirror, Simons watched the two officers approach. He recognized them as the same two he'd seen in the hardware store, Parker and Reynolds. They were being very cautious, one on each side of the car, hands hovering near their weapons. This seemed like a lot of caution for a routine traffic stop. Something's not right, Simons thought to himself. Officer Parker approached the driver's side window while Reynolds stood back slightly, his hand still near his holster. Parker's face was serious, his eyes scanning the inside of the car. "Good morning, officer," Simons said calmly. "Is there a problem?" "License and registration," Parker demanded without answering the question. His tone was harsh, not the professional courtesy Simons expected from his officers. "Of course," Simons replied. "My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for them now, okay?" Parker didn't acknowledge Simons's careful narration of his movements. Another red flag. Every officer in Westbridge was trained to appreciate when a driver clearly communicated what they were doing during a stop. "Just keep your hands where I can see them for now," Parker said. "What's under your jacket on the passenger seat?" Simons glanced at his toolkit. "That's just some tools I bought at the hardware store. I covered them with my jacket because of the rain." "Tools, huh?" Officer Reynolds said from the passenger side. His voice was full of disbelief. "Same kind of tools used to break into stores around here?" Now Simons understood. They thought he was connected to the recent robberies. The realization was like a bucket of cold water. They weren't seeing Police Chief Simons Marlowe. They were seeing a black man in a car who matched some vague description. "There's been a misunderstanding," Simons began. We'll get to that," Parker interrupted. "Now, slowly reach for your registration." Simons carefully opened the glove compartment and removed his vehicle registration. He handed it to Parker, who glanced at it but didn't seem to register the name. "Now your license," Parker instructed. "It's in my back pocket," Simons repeated. "I need to reach for it." "Do it slowly," Parker warned. As Simons began to move his hand toward his pocket, Reynolds suddenly shouted, "He's reaching!" In an instant, both officers had drawn their weapons. "Hands on the wheel! Now!" Parker yelled. Simons froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He slowly returned his hands to the steering wheel. 25 years in law enforcement had taught him how quickly these situations could turn deadly. "Officers," he said, keeping his voice steady, "I was just reaching for my license as instructed. I'm not armed. I'm not a threat." A few cars passed by slowly, drivers rubbernecking at the scene. A couple of pedestrians had stopped on the sidewalk watching. One had a phone out, probably recording. "Step out of the vehicle," Parker ordered. "Officer, if you'll let me get my ID, you'll see—" "Out of the car! Now!" Parker's voice had risen to a shout. Simons knew that arguing would only escalate the situation. With deliberate slowness, he opened the car door and stepped out, hands raised slightly. "Turn around and place your hands on the roof of the vehicle," Reynolds instructed. Simons complied, the cold metal of the car roof damp under his palms. He could feel people watching. Here he was, the police chief of Westbridge, being treated like a criminal on a busy street in his own town. Parker patted him down roughly while Reynolds kept his weapon trained on Simons. "What's your name?" Parker demanded. For a split second, Simons considered answering with his title. Chief Simons Marlowe. 4 words that would end this immediately. But something made him hold back. A lifetime of similar experiences, of being judged by his skin before anything else, made him wonder how far this would go. "Simons Marlowe," he answered, leaving off his title. The name didn't register with the officers. They hadn't been in town long enough to know it. "Mr. Marlowe, we received a report of suspicious activity at Wilson's Hardware," Parker said. "A man matching your description was seen hiding something under his jacket." "That would be the toolkit I purchased," Simons replied evenly. As I mentioned before, Reynolds had moved to the passenger side and was looking at the toolkit under the jacket. "Got something here," he called. "That's what I told you. Tools from the hardware store," Simons said. "We've had several robberies in this area," Parker continued, ignoring Simons's explanation. "Businesses are on high alert." "I understand," Simons said. "But I'm not your robber." Parker took out his handcuffs. "We're going to detain you while we sort this out." "Is that really necessary?" Simons asked, still calm, but feeling a growing sense of indignation. "It's standard procedure," Parker replied, though it wasn't, not for a simple suspicious person. Call with no evidence of a crime. As the cold metal of the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Simons made a decision. He wouldn't reveal his identity yet. He would experience what any other black man in Westbridge might experience in this situation. The knowledge tightened in his chest, like the handcuffs on his wrists. More people had gathered now. Some had phones out, recording the scene. Simons recognized a few faces, people who knew him, watching in confusion as their police chief was handcuffed on a public street. "We're taking you to the station," Parker announced, guiding Simons toward the patrol car. Simons went without resistance, his mind already thinking about what would happen when they arrived at his station, at his department, where everyone knew exactly who Simons Marlowe was. "Watch your head," Officer Parker said, as he guided Simons into the back seat of the patrol car. The words were standard procedure, but Parker's tone was cold. Simons sat in the cramped back seat, hands still cuffed behind him. The plastic seat was hard and uncomfortable, something he'd never thought about before when putting people in his own patrol car. Through the window, Simons could see Officer Reynolds talking to the small crowd that had gathered. Several people had their phones out, recording everything. Some were pointing at Simons, confusion on their faces. He recognized Mrs. Diaz from the community center and Mr. Washington from the barber shop. They knew who he was. Reynolds returned to the car and got in the driver's seat. Parker sat in the passenger side. "People are saying that's Chief Marlowe," Reynolds said quietly to Parker, but Simons could hear every word. "What?" Parker turned to look at Simons in the back seat. Really, seeing him for the first time. This was the moment Simons could clear everything up. But something made him stay silent. If this was happening to him, someone with power and authority in this town, what was happening to other black men who didn't have his position? "Can't be." Parker dismissed the idea. Why would the chief be in regular clothes? And why wouldn't he say something? "I don't know," Reynolds said, sounding uncertain. "Maybe we should check his ID before we take him in." "We're already this far," Parker replied. "Let's just get him to the station and sort it out there." As they drove toward the police station, Simons noticed people on the sidewalks stopping to stare. Word was spreading quickly. In a town the size of Westbridge, news traveled fast. "Got a lot of people watching," Reynolds said nervously. "Just drive," Parker snapped. Simons shifted in his seat, the handcuffs digging into his wrists. "Officers, I think we can resolve this situation more easily if you just check my ID." "We'll check everything at the station," Parker said. But Simons could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. They stopped at a red light, and a car pulled up beside them. The driver, an older white woman named Ms. Abernathy who volunteered at city events, looked over and gasped when she saw Simons in the back seat. "Chief Marlowe?" she called through the window. "What on earth?" Reynolds and Parker exchanged alarmed glances. "Drive," Parker ordered, even though the light was still red. Reynolds hesitated, then drove through the red light with their flashers still on. "This is getting out of hand," Reynolds said, his voice tight with stress. Simons leaned forward. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job, but there's been a misunderstanding. If you check my wallet, you'll find my police ID." Parker turned around, his face suddenly pale. "Are you claiming to be Chief Marlowe?" "I am Chief Marlowe," Simons replied calmly. "As several people have now pointed out to you." Reynolds gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Sir, if you're really the chief, why didn't you say something right away?" It was a fair question, and Simons had been asking himself the same thing. I was curious to see how this would play out, Simons said truthfully. To see how my officers treat citizens when they think no one's watching. The patrol car was silent as the officers processed this information. We should verify his identity, Reynolds said, pulling over to the side of the road. Not here, Parker replied, looking at the growing number of people watching from the sidewalk. Too many people. Let's get to the station. The station was only a few blocks away now. Simons could see the familiar brick building ahead. Officers were coming in and out for shift change. Some stopped to stare as the patrol car pulled into the parking lot. Great, Parker muttered. The whole department's here. As Reynolds parked, Officer Rodriguez walked toward the car. He was a 5-year veteran who Simons had personally promoted last year. Rodriguez's eyes widened when he saw Simons in the back seat. "Chief?" he asked in disbelief. Before either Parker or Reynolds could respond, Simmons nodded to Rodriguez. "Morning, Tony. Interesting day so far." Rodriguez looked from Simons to the two officers, confusion all over his face. "What's going on?" "Just a misunderstanding," Simons said before the other officers could answer. "Would you mind helping me out of here? These cuffs are getting uncomfortable." Rodriguez immediately opened the back door. Parker and Reynolds stood, frozen, the reality of their situation finally hitting them. "Sir," Parker began, his voice shaking slightly, "we had a report of suspicious activity." "Let's talk inside," Simons interrupted, nodding toward the growing crowd of officers and civilians gathering in the parking lot. Rodriguez helped Simons out of the car and quickly removed the handcuffs. Simons rubbed his wrists, noting the red marks left behind. "Are you okay, sir?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "I'm fine, Tony," Simons assured him. "But I'd like a word with these officers in private." The walk into the station was one Simons would never forget. Officers stopped what they were doing to stare. Phones rang unanswered. The usual buzz of conversation went silent. Behind him, Parker and Reynolds followed like condemned men walking to their fate. At the front desk, Sergeant Williams looked up from his paperwork. His mouth fell open when he saw Simons in casual clothes, rubbing his wrists, followed by two very pale officers. "Chief Marlowe," Williams said, standing quickly. "What happened?" Simons managed a small smile. "I think Officers Parker and Reynolds, and I need to have a conversation in the conference room." He turned to the two officers. "And I'll need your body camera footage. All of it." The look on their faces told Simons everything he needed to know. They understood the gravity of what had just happened. Their careers, possibly their futures in law enforcement, now hung in the balance. As Simons walked toward the conference room, he caught his reflection in a glass door. He wasn't wearing his uniform or his badge, but he was still the chief. At least, he was inside the station. Outside, on the streets of his own town, he was just another black man considered suspicious until proven otherwise. That reality weighed on him heavier than any handcuffs. Simons entered the station through the main doors rather than his usual private entrance. The familiar lobby looked different from this perspective. Officers and staff stared as he passed, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern. "Chief, should I call someone?" Sergeant Williams asked, following behind him. "The mayor? The union rep?" "Not yet," Simons replied. "First, I need Officers Parker and Reynolds to process me properly." "Process you?" Williams looked shocked. "Sir, this is clearly a mistake." "Is it?" Simons asked quietly. "Or is it department policy to handcuff people based on vague reports, without checking their ID?" Williams fell silent, understanding dawning on his face. "Officers..." Simons turned to Parker and Reynolds, who stood awkwardly by the front desk. "You brought me in. You need to complete the paperwork." "Sir," Parker began, his face flushed. "We didn't know." "That's right." Simons cut him off. "You didn't know. So treat me like you would any other person you've brought in under these circumstances." Parker and Reynolds exchanged nervous glances before leading Simons to the processing area. The usual bustle of the station had gone quiet. Everyone was watching. "Do you want me in the holding cell too?" Simons asked as they reached the booking desk. "That won't be necessary, sir," Reynolds said quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it would be necessary if I weren't the chief, wouldn't it?" Neither officer answered. "Take my photo and fingerprints," Simons instructed. "Document everything, just like you would with anyone else." With trembling hands, Parker took Simons's mugshot, while Reynolds filled out the intake form. Other officers gathered at a distance, watching the uncomfortable scene unfold. "Reason for detention?" Reynolds asked, staring at the form. "What did the hardware store clerk tell you?" Simons asked. "That a suspicious man put items under his jacket and left the store," Parker answered. "And did you find those items?" "Yes, sir. The toolkit." "Which I paid for," Simons added. "Did you check with the store to confirm that?" The officer's silence was answer enough. "So the charge would be?" Simons prompted. "There is no charge," Reynolds admitted. "It was a stop for questioning." "Based on?" "A report of suspicious activity." "My activity being black in my own town?" Simons thought, but didn't say aloud. He didn't need to. The truth hung in the air between them. Officer Rodriguez approached cautiously. "Chief, your wife is on the phone. Someone called her about what happened." Simons sighed. "Lisa would be worried. Tell her I'm fine, and I'll call her back soon." As Rodriguez left, Simons noticed a young officer named Miller watching from across the room. Miller was new, just 6 months on the force, and still learning. The lesson he was getting today wasn't in any training manual. "Put me in the holding cell," Simons decided. "Sir?" Parker looked alarmed. "The holding cell? Where you put people while you sort things out." "Chief Marlowe, I don't think," Williams began. "It's important," Simons insisted. Reluctantly, the EE officers led Simons to the small holding cell at the back of the station. It was empty today, a small mercy. Simons walked in and heard the cell door close behind him. The sound of the lock clicking into place sent a chill through him. From inside the cell, Simons had a different view of the station. Officers moved about their duties, occasionally glancing his way with uncomfortable expressions. Some whispered to each other. Others made phone calls, probably spreading the news. Simons sat on the hard bench and waited. Through the glass partition, he could see Parker and Reynolds in Williams's office. Their body language told the story. Shoulders slumped, heads down, occasionally gesturing as they tried to explain themselves. Young Officer Miller approached the cell cautiously. "Excuse me, Chief," Miller said. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "No, thank you, Miller," Simons replied. "But I appreciate you asking." Miller hesitated, then asked, "Sir, may I ask why you're doing this?" It was a good question, direct and honest. "What do you see when you look at me right now, Miller?" Simons asked. Miller looked confused. "I see my chief, sir." "That's right. You know who I am." "But this morning, 2 of our officers didn't see their chief. They saw a suspicious black man who needed to be handcuffed." Miller nodded slowly, understanding. Sometimes, we need to experience things firsthand to understand them, Simons continued. "Today, I'm experiencing what many citizens in our community experience." "It's not right," Miller said quietly. "No, it's not," Simons agreed. And that's why I'm still in this cell. So everyone here remembers this day. Miller straightened his back. Is there anything you want me to do, sir? Simons thought for a moment. Yes. Find out who was recording the traffic stop. We'll need those videos. As Miller hurried off, Simmons noticed Sergeant Williams approaching with a key. That's enough. Simons, Williams said, using his first name, something he rarely did at work. They'd known each other for 20 years, had started as rookies together. You've made your point. Have I? Simons asked, not moving from the bench. Williams unlocked the cell door. The mayor's on his way. So is Captain Rivera from Internal Affairs. This is becoming a circus. Good, Simons said. Maybe people will. Pay attention. The officers are devastated, Williams said. They know they messed up. They did more than mess up, Thomas, Simons replied, using Williams's first name too. They showed us exactly what's wrong with policing, even here, in my own department. Williams couldn't argue with that. What happens now? He asked instead. Simons finally stood up. Now we deal with this properly. Body cameras, witness statements, and a thorough review. No shortcuts. As Simons stepped out of the cell, he saw Officer Rodriguez holding a phone. Chief, there's someone here who wants to talk to you. It's Tim from the hardware store. He says his new employee is really upset about what happened. Apparently, the kid had no idea who you were. And suddenly, a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The nervous new employee who'd been watching him in the store. The call to police about a suspicious man. It all started with someone who didn't know him, who only saw a black man in a store. Tell Tim I'll call him back, Simons said. Right now, I need to have a conversation with Officers Parker and Reynolds. As Simons walked toward the conference room where the two officers waited, he knew this day would change his department. Forever. It had already changed him. Simons paused outside the conference room door. Through the small window, he could see Officers Parker and Reynolds sitting at the table. Parker was staring at his hands while Reynolds kept checking his phone, probably looking for texts from his union rep. Sergeant Williams stood beside Simons. Do you want me in there with you? Simons shook his head. Not yet. I need to talk to them first. Alone. The body camera footage is being downloaded now, Williams said, and people are already posting videos of the traffic stop online. That was fast, Simons said. One has over 1,000 views already, Williams added. People are angry. Simons wasn't surprised. Make sure both officers are protected. No names released yet. You're protecting them? Williams asked, raising an eyebrow. I'm protecting the process, Simons corrected. This isn't about punishing two officers. It's about fixing a broken system. With that, Simons opened the door and stepped inside. Both officers immediately jumped to their feet. Sir, Parker began, his voice cracking. We can't begin to apologize. Simons held up his hand, stopping him mid-sentence. He took a seat across from them and gestured for them to sit down too. Before we start, Simons said calmly, I want to make one thing clear. This conversation is about understanding what happened today and why. It's not a disciplinary hearing. That will come later. The officers exchanged nervous glances. Now, Simons continued, walk me through it, from the beginning. Reynolds spoke first. We received a call about a suspicious person at Wilson's Hardware. The clerk reported someone putting merchandise under their jacket. Did the clerk mention my race? Simons asked. Reynolds thought for a moment. No, sir, not specifically. But you assumed, Simons stated. The clerk described a man in a gray shirt and jeans, Parker added. When we saw you driving away from the area, you matched that description. A lot of people match that description, Simons pointed out. Yes, sir, Parker admitted. So why me? Simons asked directly. What made you decide I was your suspicious person? The officers fell silent, neither wanting to answer the question. I'm not here to trap you, Simons assured them. I genuinely want to understand what you were thinking. After a long pause, Reynolds spoke. You were leaving the area where the call came from. You matched the basic description, and, Simons prompted, and you fit the profile of the robbery suspect we've been looking for, Parker finished. The profile, Simons repeated. You mean a black man. Parker looked down at the table. It wasn't just that, sir. Then, what was it? Simons asked. Because, from where I'm sitting, that seems to be the main factor. Neither officer had an answer. Let's move on, Simons said. After you pulled me over, I identified myself as reaching for my ID. Why did you draw your weapons? Standard procedure when... Parker began. It is not standard procedure in this department, Simons interrupted. Our policy clearly states that officers should only draw their weapons when there is an imminent threat. We thought you might be armed, Reynolds explained. Based on what evidence? Again, silence. Simons leaned forward. Officers, I need you to understand something. What happened today isn't just about me. It's about every black person in West. Bridge, who gets pulled over. It's about the fear they feel when they see those lights in their mirror. The door opened, and Captain Rivera from Internal Affairs entered with Sergeant Williams. Rivera was carrying a laptop. Sorry to interrupt. Chief, Rivera said, but I thought you should see this right away. He placed the laptop on the table and played a video. It was body camera footage from Officer Parker's vest. The video showed the entire traffic stop from the officer's perspective. Watching it was different from living it. Simons saw himself sitting calmly in his car, while Parker approached with his hand already near his weapon. He heard the harsh tone in Parker's voice, something he hadn't fully registered in the moment. When the video reached the point where Simons was reaching for his license, Reynolds' shout of, "He's reaching!" sounded panicked and out of proportion. The camera showed both officers drawing their weapons at a man who was clearly just following instructions. Parker's face reddened as he watched himself on screen. "Stop it there," Simons said, as the video showed him being handcuffed. Rivera paused the footage. "Officers," Simons said quietly, "is this how you were trained to conduct traffic stops?" "No, sir," they both answered. "Did I make any threatening moves? Did I resist in any way?" "No, sir," Parker admitted. "Then why did this happen?" Simons asked. Reynolds took a deep breath. "We overreacted, sir. It was a start, but not enough." "Why did you overreact?" Simons pressed. After a long silence, Parker finally said what everyone in the room already knew. "Because you're black, sir. We saw a black man who matched a vague description, and we assumed the worst." The admission hung in the air. It wasn't easy to say, and it couldn't have been easy to hear for the other officers in the room, but it was the truth. "Thank you for your honesty," Simons said. "That's the first step toward fixing this." The tension in the room eased slightly with his words. "What happens now, Chief?" Reynolds asked. "Now we follow procedure," Simons explained. "Internal Affairs will conduct a full investigation. There will be a disciplinary hearing. The body camera footage and witness statements will be reviewed. We'll lose our jobs," Parker said, his voice barely audible. "That's not for me to decide right now," Simons replied. "But I want you both to understand something. This isn't just about you. This is a symptom of a larger problem." Simons stood up and walked to the window overlooking the station parking lot. A small crowd had gathered outside, community members who had heard what happened. I became a police officer for the same reason many of you did, Simons continued, to protect and serve. But that means protecting and serving everyone equally. It means checking our biases at the door. He turned back to face the officers. Every day, black men and women in this town, in every town, face what I face today. The difference is, they don't have a badge to protect them once they get to the station. The door opened again, and Officer Rodriguez appeared. Chief, the YDD mayor's here, and there are reporters outside. Simons nodded. Tell them I'll be out shortly. As Rodriguez left, Simons looked at Parker and Reynolds one more time. I don't know what's going to happen to you two, he said honestly, but I do know what's going to happen to this department. We're going to learn from this. We're going to do better. He headed for the door, then stopped. One more thing. When I was in that cell, I made a decision. This incident won't be swept under the rug. It won't be handled quietly. The community deserves to know what happened and what we're going to do about it. With that, Simons left the conference room. As he walked through the station, officers and staff watched him with new eyes. Some looked ashamed, others thoughtful. A few nodded with respect. The events of today would change things. They had to. Because next time, it might not be the police chief in handcuffs. It might be someone without his power and position. Someone who wouldn't get the chance to teach a lesson. Someone who might not survive the encounter. Simons stepped into his office for the first time that day. The familiar space felt different somehow. His neatly organized desk, the family photos, the certificates on the wall, all reminders of what he had accomplished. Yet today had shown him how quickly those accomplishments could be forgotten when he was out of uniform. There was a knock at the door. Mayor Wilson entered without waiting for a response. She was a tall woman in her 60s, with silver hair and a no-nonsense attitude. Simons, she said, closing the door behind her. The press is having a field day with this. We need to get out in front of it. Hello to you too, Diana, Simons replied calmly. The mayor took a seat across from his desk. I've got reporters asking if our police department profiles black citizens. I've got community leaders demanding answers. And I've got social media exploding with videos of our police chief in handcuffs. What exactly happened today? Simons explained the events of the morning. His trip to the hardware store, the misunderstanding with the new clerk, the traffic stop, and his decision to let it play out. You could have identified yourself immediately, Mayor Wilson pointed out. Yes, Simons agreed. And nothing would have changed. Those officers would still be out there, making the same assumptions, treating other black citizens the same way. The mayor sighed. What are you planning to do about it? First, I want a meeting with the officers involved and their sergeant. Then we'll talk to the press. And say what? The truth, Simons said simply. That we have work to do. Mayor Wilson looked skeptical, but nodded. It's your department, but the city council will want answers too. They'll get them, Simons promised. But first I need to finish what I started today. After the mayor left, Simons sent a message to Sergeant Williams to bring Officers Parker and Reynolds to the conference room again, along with himself and Captain Rivera. Before heading to the meeting, Simons called his wife. Lisa answered on the first ring. Are you okay? She asked immediately. I'm fine, Simons assured her. Physically, at least. The phone's been ringing non-stop. Everyone's seen the videos. Zoe called from school. She's worried sick. Tell her, I'm fine, Simons said. And I'm sorry about the deck project. It might have to wait. Forget the deck, Lisa said firmly. Just tell me what happened. Simons gave her the short version. "Those officers," Lisa said angrily when he finished, "they should be fired." "It's not that simple," Simons replied. "And it's not just about them." "I know," Lisa's voice softened. "It's about the whole system, just like your father always said." Simons thought of his father again, the struggles he'd faced as one of Westbridge's first black officers. Decades later, and some things hadn't changed at all. "I'll be home late," Simons told her. "I need to handle this right." "I know you will," Lisa said. "I love you." "Love you too." Simons hung up and headed to the conference room. This time, in addition to Parker, Reynolds, Williams, and Rivera, he had asked Officer Rodriguez and Officer Miller to join them. When everyone was seated, Simons remained standing, looking at each person in turn. "What happened today wasn't just a misunderstanding," Simons began. "It wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of something deeper in our department, in our profession, and in our society." He turned to Officers Parker and Reynolds. "I'm not here to shame you or punish you. That's for the disciplinary process to decide. I'm here to understand why this happened and how we can prevent it from happening again." Simons paced slowly around the table. "Officers Parker and Reynolds, you're both relatively new to Westbridge. Tell me about your training on bias in policing." The two officers exchanged glances. "We had the standard training, sir," Parker replied. "A one-day seminar on implicit bias and community policing." "One day," Simons repeated. "And did that one day change how you think? Did it change how you react when you see a black man in a car who matches a vague description?" "Apparently not," Reynolds admitted quietly. "Sergeant Williams," Simons turned to his veteran officer. "How much ongoing training do our officers receive on bias and community relations?" Williams looked uncomfortable. "The state-mandated minimum, sir, 2 hours per year of continuing education." 2 hours, Simons shook his head. "Is that enough?" "No, sir," Williams replied honestly. "Officer Rodriguez," Simons addressed the Latino officer next. "In your 5 years here, have you seen instances of different treatment based on race or neighborhood?" Rodriguez hesitated, looking at his fellow officers. "Speak freely," Simons encouraged. "No repercussions." "Yes, sir," Rodriguez answered finally. "I've seen it. Different response times to different neighborhoods. Different tones used with different people. Sometimes it's subtle, but it's there." And Officer Miller, Simons turned to the youngest. "Officer, as someone new to the force, what were you taught about how to interact with the community?" Miller sat up straight. "To be respectful, sir. To treat everyone equally." "Good," Simons nodded. "But what examples did you see from your training officers?" Miller glanced at Williams, then back at Simons. "Mixed messages, sir. The official training says one thing, but what happens on the street sometimes looks different." "Exactly," Simons said. "And that's the problem. We have policies and training that say all the right things, but our actions tell a different story." He turned to Captain Rivera. "From an internal affairs perspective, how many complaints do we receive about biased policing?" "Not many on paper," Rivera admitted. "But many community members don't file formal complaints. They don't trust the process." "Again, exactly," Simons said. "We've created a system where the people most affected by biased policing don't believe reporting it will make any difference." Simons stopped pacing and faced the group. "Today, I experienced what countless citizens experience. I was judged by my skin color before anything else. The difference is, I have this badge and this position, so everyone is paying attention now. He looked directly at Parker and Reynolds. "I need you to understand something. This isn't about making you feel guilty for being white. It's about recognizing that we all have biases. And as police officers, our biases can be dangerous, even deadly." The room was silent as his words sank in. "So what do we do?" Williams finally asked. "We start by acknowledging the problem," Simons said. "No more denying, no more excuses. Then we commit to real change, not just a one-day seminar or a new policy that sits on a shelf. Real, meaningful change in how we operate." Simons walked to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. "Let's start now. What specifically can we do differently?" After a moment of hesitation, ideas began to flow. More community engagement, better training, regular reviews of stopped data to look for patterns, body cameras always on, community oversight. Each suggestion was written on the board. As the list grew, Simons noticed a change in the room. The defensiveness was giving way to engagement. Even Parker and Reynolds were contributing ideas. "This is just the beginning," Simons said when the board was full. "Change won't happen overnight, but it has to happen." He looked at each person again. "I'm going to speak to the press in an hour. I'm going to be honest about what happened today and what we're going to do about it. That won't be comfortable for any of us, but comfort isn't the goal. Justice is." Parker raised his hand slightly. "Sir, may I ask a question?" Simons nodded. "What's going to happen to us? To me and Reynolds?" It was the question everyone was wondering. "There will be an investigation, as there should be," Simons said. "But what happens after that depends partly on you, on whether you're part of the problem or part of the solution." Simons checked his watch. "I need to prepare for the press conference. Captain Rivera will take your formal statements now. Sergeant Williams, I'd like you to join me when I speak to the media." As the others filed out, Simons stopped Parker and Reynolds at the door. "One more thing. Earlier, you asked why I didn't identify myself immediately during the traffic stop." They waited expectantly. "I've been thinking about that myself," Simons continued. "And the truth is, I wanted to know. I wanted to know if the officers who work for me would treat a black man differently than a white one. Now I know." He let that sink in before adding, "The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" With that, he left them to consider his words. As he walked back to his office to prepare for the press conference, Simons thought about what he would say and what he wouldn't say, because there was one more piece to this story, one that even his officers didn't know yet, a piece that would change everything when it was revealed. Simons stood in his office, gathering his thoughts before the press conference. The station was buzzing with activity, officers talking in hushed tones, phones ringing constantly, community members gathering outside. What had started as a simple trip to the hardware store had turned into something much bigger. There was a knock at his door. It was Officer Rodriguez. "Chief, they're ready for you in the briefing room. Press is all set up." "Thank you, Tony," Simons replied. "There's something I need to tell you first." Rodriguez looked curious. "Sir?" "What happened today wasn't just bad luck," Simons began. "It was part of something I've been working on for almost a year now." Simons walked to his filing cabinet and unlocked the bottom drawer, the one he kept secured at all times. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Community Accountability Project and handed it to Rodriguez. "What is this?" Rodriguez asked, opening the folder. "The truth," Simons replied simply. Inside were dozens of reports, data sheets, and photographs. Rodriguez flipped through them, his eyes growing wider with each page. "I don't understand," he said finally. "You've been running tests on our own department?" Simons nodded. "For the past year, I've been quietly collecting data on how our officers interact with different citizens in Westbridge. Traffic stops, street interviews, response times to calls, everything broken down by neighborhood, race, and age. Does the mayor know about this?" "No one knew," Simons said. "Not until today." Rodriguez continued reading. "You sent people through town to see how officers would react to them?" "Yes. Volunteers of different races, dressed the same way, driving the same cars, walking through the same neighborhoods. The results were troubling." "And today? Was today part of this, too?" Simons nodded. "The hardware store clerk who called about me? He's new, but he was briefed by Tim Wilson. Tim's been helping with the project. Those random citizens recording the traffic stop? 2 of them were volunteers. Even your assignment to patrol that area today wasn't a coincidence." Rodriguez looked stunned. "So, you plan to be stopped?" "I plan to test the system," Simons corrected. "I didn't know which officers would be involved or exactly how it would play out. But yes, I set it up to see what would happen when a black man in casual clothes was reported as suspicious in his own town." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because I needed honest reactions," Simons explained. "If officers knew they were being tested, they'd be on their best behavior. I needed to see the truth." Rodriguez sat down heavily in a chair. "The other officers are going to feel like they were set up." "They weren't set up," Simons said firmly. "They were observed. There's a difference. Nobody made Parker and Reynolds draw their weapons. Nobody made them handcuff me without checking my ID. They made those choices themselves." Before Rodriguez could respond, Sergeant Williams appeared at the door. "Press is getting restless, Chief," he said. "We should go." "One moment," Simons replied. "There's something you need to see first." He handed the folder to Williams, who quickly scanned its contents. His expression moved from confusion to understanding to something like respect. "You've been planning this for a long time," Williams said finally. "Not this specific incident," Simons clarified. "But yes, I've been gathering data and running tests. Today was just supposed to be another data point. I didn't expect it to go this far." Williams handed the folder back. "What are you going to tell the press?" "Everything," Simons said. "It's time for complete transparency." The 3 men walked to the briefing room together. It was packed with reporters, cameras, and microphones. In the back, Simons spotted Mayor Wilson looking nervous, and next to her, Tim from the hardware store. Officers Parker and Reynolds stood against the wall, still in uniform but looking uncomfortable. Simons stepped up to the podium, aware that every word would be recorded and analyzed. He placed the folder on the podium, took a deep breath, and began. "Good afternoon. As many of you know, there was an incident today involving myself and 2 Westbridge police officers. I was pulled over, handcuffed, and brought to the station based on a report of suspicious activity at a local store." Cameras flashed as he continued. "What most people don't know is that this incident was part of a year-long project I've been conducting to assess patterns of policing in our community." A murmur ran through the room. Mayor Wilson's eyes widened in surprise. "For the past year, my team and I have been collecting data on police interactions across Westbridge. We've sent volunteers of different races through the same neighborhoods to see how they're treated. We've analyzed traffic stop data, arrest records, and response times, and we've found clear patterns of different treatment based on race." Simons opened the folder and pulled out several charts. He held them up for the cameras. "These numbers tell a story that's hard to ignore. Black and brown citizens in Westbridge are 3 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white citizens. They wait an average of 7 minutes longer for police response, and they're 5 times more likely to have force used against them during an arrest. The room was completely silent now. Today, I experienced that difference firsthand. And while what happened to me was troubling, what's more troubling is that it happens to people in our community every day, people without a badge to protect them when they get to the station. Simons looked directly at the officers along the wall. I'm not here to shame individual officers. The problem is bigger than any one person. It's about systems and cultures that have developed over decades. But now that we can see the problem clearly, we have a responsibility to fix it. He pulled out another document from the folder. This is a 10-point plan for reform in the Westbridge Police Department. It includes improved training, community oversight, regular data review, and policy changes. Starting tomorrow, every officer will receive this plan, and we will begin implementation immediately. Simons paused, looking around the room. Some will say I tricked my officers. I didn't. I simply created a situation where their true instincts would show. Others will say I should have identified myself immediately during the traffic stop. Perhaps, but if I had, we wouldn't be having this important conversation today. He closed the folder and stood tall at the podium. Today marks a turning point for policing in Westbridge. The data is clear. The need for change is clear. And my commitment to that change is clear. I'll now take questions. Hands shot up all around the room. As Simons began answering questions, he noticed Officers Parker and Reynolds watching intently from the back. Their faces showed shock at the revelation of his project, but also something else. Understanding, perhaps. Or maybe the beginning of it. The path forward wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, defensiveness, and hard conversations ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Simons felt hopeful. Real change was possible. And it started here, today, with the truth. It started with a police chief who was willing to experience what too many of his citizens experienced every day. It started with recognition. Thanks for joining us for this inspiring story of Maya Marlowe's triumph in court. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop your location in the comments below. If this story of determination and justice touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful stories like Maya's every week that will move and inspire you. Remember, whether you're facing your own challenges or supporting someone else through theirs, a little kindness goes a long way. Share this video with someone who needs encouragement today. Until next time, keep standing up for what's right.